Well, good morning everybody and welcome to the virtual field trip to Fotheringhay village in northeast Northamptonshire. I provided you with a little PowerPoint with a dozen slides just to locate us where we are in northeast Northamptonshire alongside the River Nen, and also to provide you with some specific details on what we're going to be looking at, and also a plan of the village that will enable you to, as it were, walk around with us, know where we are. It's a fantastic village for the medievalist. It was a stronghold of the Yorkists in the Middle Ages, a great power centre really in medieval England, and there are several sites associated with that still to be seen, most particularly the Yorkists' great church and mausoleum over to my right, and to my left, which we'll look at in a minute, is their castle. Well, we've moved around just a couple of 100 yards from the bridge where we started off to the castle site. It's private land, but it's accessible to the public, and it's also a scheduled ancient monument. That's a legally protected site. And on this board here, and we'll do a shot of this so you can read the text, there are actually a couple of excellent illustrations, reconstructions. The castle was built sometime around about 1100, in other words just 2 or 3 decades after the Norman conquest, by the Earl of Northampton, Simon de Senlis, and it grew and developed over the centuries. In fact, it had a lifespan of 500 years. The first illustration is of the castle in the Norman period, essentially as a motte and bailey. And then down here, we've got it really in its heyday in the late 14th century. But it was only in the 17th century that it actually went into decline. So a castle with a very, very long history indeed. And that's something we'll be looking at as we go around the site. We've moved round outside one of Fotheringhay's 2 baileys. There's one on this side of the castle mound, the motte, and there's one on the other side where the stone barn is, Castle Farm. And then beyond that, of course, you can see the church, which we previously saw from the bridge. So that gives you some idea of the very intimate scale of Fotheringhay. A bailey was where castles had most of their buildings, the great hall, the chapel, the accommodation, the kitchens, and so forth. The motte, the great mound there, had a very specific function. It was elevated so it provided a viewpoint for the landscape around, and as we'll see, Fotheringhay is a really cracking topographical position. But also sometimes, as at Fotheringhay, it's when the very prestigious main chamber of the Lord was situated. But anyway, we're going to go actually into the bailey and talk about what there was at Fotheringhay. So we've walked up now into the bailey, and behind us you can see the bridge where we started off, to give you some idea of the very compressed nature of Fotheringhay, and again with the church popping up behind the motte just there. So here we are in the bailey enclosure, surrounded by a bank, presumably with some kind of defence on, and a deep water-filled moat behind. And it's within this bailey that the most significant buildings stood, including the Great Hall, where administrative and ceremonial functions would have been carried on. And those included in 1587 the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, who was imprisoned in the castle for about a year. And if you Google Mary Queen of Scots execution, you'll find a contemporary pen drawing showing the scene of the execution with the witnesses ranged on a grandstand at one end of the Great Hall, and at the other, the platform where the actual beheading took place. It was a fairly grisly affair, as any execution was, I'm sure. But in this particular case, because there was such a desire to prevent relics of the execution, blood-stained clothing, leaping out to the adherents of the old faith, the Roman Catholic faith, as soon as Mary was executed, the clothes were removed and everything, the executioner's block too, was thrown onto the fire in the Great Hall and was burnt to prevent any relics entering the Catholic community. And the story that everybody knows, I think, about Mary Queen of Scots' execution, as the execution took place and she fell, her small dog, which had been hiding underneath her skirts, ran out. Clearly a very, very dramatic moment indeed for all witnesses. So what we're going to do now, we're going to actually have a quick look at the bridge and its sighting on the River Nen, and then we'll climb up the very steep motte itself. Now just one quick word about mottes in Norman castles, what form they took. A few have been excavated, Abinger and South Mimms, and then Hen Domen, which is on the border with Wales. And the original fighting platform on the top was sometimes constructed as a great timber palisade around the top. But what we also find sometimes is that the first thing they constructed was, as it were, a great heavyweight timber electricity pylon from ground level that rose up to an elevated observation and fighting platform, but only then was earth mounded up around it to protect and give stability, sometimes with a tunnel connecting from ground level in the bailey through the base of the motte, actually into the base of the actual fighting platform and tower there. We've got no idea what the original form of the fighting platform building on top of the motte was at Fotheringhay, but we do have an idea of what it looked like towards the end of its life. And if you look on the PowerPoint, there's an early 17th century drawn bird's eye view of what was clearly a stone building ringed around the top of the motte, but the documents tell us that by that time it was in pretty poor repair indeed, and indeed the castle was dismantled not so very long after, we think in the 1620s. Anyway, we'll now move to have a look at the bridge, and then we're going to climb up on top of the motte. So we've just moved a few paces to the corner of the bailey, because from here we get a very good view of the bridge, which was rebuilt in the 1570s by the Gumbolds, one of the leading families of masons hereabouts. We're quite close to the Weldon stone quarries, where a very fine quality limestone has been got for centuries, which can be cut as ashlar into blocks, and that's what we can see the bridge built as. It's across the River Nen, and the River Nen in the Middle Ages and indeed a bit later was navigable as far as the Wash. So that gives us the answer of why Fotheringhay was established in this rather obscure corner of northeast Northamptonshire. It's because it's an important crossing point, and that is what the castle was placed to control. It's got strategic importance. Next, we're going to go actually up onto the motte itself and see what we can see from up there, and I think we'll get an idea of that strategic siting much better from there. From the motte top we can appreciate two things above all. Firstly, what a commanding position the castle stands on. It's the highest spot for miles around with panoramic views in every direction. This was indeed a strategic site. The other thing we can appreciate is how the castle stands at the centre of what we would usually call a landscape of lordship. Beneath the castle there was a large artificial lake or fish pond providing fresh fish for the castle kitchens. Beyond it, out in the landscape, was the castle's great park, the hunting park, the deer park, and in the PowerPoint I've included a 17th century map of the park and also a modern LiDAR image where you can still see the pale, the boundary of the park. Fotheringhay in fact had two parks. It also had a little park which lay out at 90 degrees in that direction, and that was a more intimate park, close to the castle, a place to go and walk and get recreation, a place to get away from the communal life, the hurly-burly, the noise, the lack of privacy that would have been a feature of life within a castle with probably many dozen people when the Lord was in residence. And I can also introduce to you a new discovery that hasn't actually made it into the literature yet, something I spotted on the LiDAR when I was idly looking at Ridge and Furrow one evening around here, because I live in just Warmington, just one village that way, and that is a ringwork. And again, I've included that in the PowerPoint, and there's a red line around that ringwork, a circular earthwork about 70 metres across that stands again on a bluff above the River Nen, within what was the later Little Park, and almost certainly that was a siege castle, a remnant of a barely documented siege which Fotheringhay Castle suffered in the 12th century. A military earthwork thrown up very, very quickly indeed, just out of bowshot range, and I very much hope that in the future I'm going to learn more about it. Anyway, next we're going to move on into Fotheringhay village itself and look at some of the buildings which are associated with the castle there. We've now left the castle site and we're in the first part of Fotheringhay village, where in the late Middle Ages 2 inns were built to accommodate visitors to the castle, because as I explained there would have been at times several dozen people there and they couldn't all be placed within the castle. On the left we've got what's known as the Old Inn, which was converted, as you can see, into cottages in the 18th century, a very picturesque group, typical group in North Northamptonshire with thatched roofs. And then facing the Old Inn on the other side of the road, which we'll show you, we've got the New Inn, which is rather more upmarket, built in about 1460 and with the Royal Arms above the gate. And then we're going to walk off down the village street and we're going to visit the church. We've just moved 50 yards or so along the street and arrived at Fotheringhay Church, which is one of the most magnificent perpendicular late medieval buildings in England, set up by the Dukes of York in the early 15th century and serving as their college of priests until the dissolution in the 1540s. The original building was much larger than we see today. The east end off to the left was demolished at the dissolution, but what's left is still a really magnificent building. So let's go and have a look at it. Construction of the church took 30 or 40 years and they didn't finish glazing the building for another 20 after that in the 1470s or 1480s. The church was but one component of the college buildings, because the residential part lay over this wall, and you can see over there that substantial raised platform down on the edge of the floodplain of the River Nen, with the bridge where we started off in the background. That's where the college buildings were. There was a substantial establishment at the college in the 15th century, and I shall have to crib from Pevsner to give you the actual correct number. There was a master, 12 fellows, 8 clerks and 13 choristers, so about 30 people in all. And they lived in a quadrangular arrangement of building, just like an Oxford college, over this wall. And you can see the substantial platform there, down on the floodplain of the River Nen, with the bridge in the background where we started. And those college buildings stood until the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1540s, when they were demolished. We've now moved round to the east end of the church, which was originally much longer than it is today. In fact, we've lost perhaps half the length of the church. What we've lost, first of all, is the choir, where services would have been said, and then most especially we've lost the very eastern end of the church, the chancel, and where the chantry chapels of the Dukes of York was, because this was their mausoleum, this was their place of burial. The first to be buried here was the second Duke of York, who fell at Agincourt in 1415, and then the third Duke of York, who fell at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. He too was buried here, along with many other members of the family. And so the east end of the church was the mausoleum filled with the Yorkist tombs. A magnificent collection, no doubt. Unfortunately, there's no record whatsoever. The college was dissolved in 1548, and immediately and quite deliberately the lead was stripped from the roof to make it unusable, to make there being no chance of the college arising from the ashes again. And when Queen Elizabeth came here 20 odd years later in 1566, she was absolutely horrified to find the state of her ancestors' tombs, and she gave an order that the monuments, or at least replacements for them, should be moved back inside the church. And that's what we have today in there. They're actually not the original 15th century monuments that are perhaps decayed beyond repair. They are actually fairly cheap jack replacements made from bits and bobs that were in the mason's yard anyway. We can see they don't fit together quite properly. And it was at that point in the 1560s, 1570s that finally the chancel was demolished, or what remained of it, and the choir, and the blocking was put across the arch, which we can see there, that led in the centre from the nave of the church into the choir, and to either side from the side aisles into the aisles of the choir. Well, there we are. That's been a very fleeting introduction to the glories of Fotheringhay, and I hope you found it interesting, and it's perhaps encouraged you to actually come and visit the site, and particularly the interior of the church, which we can't get into this morning. Lastly, I'd just like to pay a very heartfelt thanks to the man behind the camera, my pal Perry, who's given up his morning to do this. Thanks very much indeed.